Welcome back to Tragic Hollywood. I'm Natalie.
And I'm Paige.
And this week we're talking about the punk icon Sid Vicious. Now, there's something strange about the way we turn certain people into cultural icons. That's something that we have been exploring in this segment. Everyone that we've talked about becomes famous a lot of times for what's destroying them, and Sid's no different. He has been immortalized as this ultimate symbol of punk rock rebellion, and the reality of his life is so much sadder, messier, and complicated than the image that has survived him. His story is tangled in the rise of punk, in addiction, in violence, in his incredibly destructive relationship with Nancy Spungen. And ultimately, they're two people who didn't survive their relationship or their story.
It's wild to me because growing up, culturally, the UK and the US, we know Sid and Nancy. We know the Sex Pistols. For crying out loud, Sid was from the UK, but everything happened in New York. So it was just another story of the UK and the US having something culturally tie them and intertwining them. But what was so wild to me is that he was only 21. Like I said, growing up, knowing it felt like this was like a full-on adult, not just a young adult. And while I was into punk music in high school, I was not like a Sex Pistols fan because also they were in the 70s in their heyday. Like, obviously people still listen to them, but they weren't really like on like the cool list, in high school. There were so many other bands that were likely inspired by the Sex Pistols, but it's also so interesting to me too, Natalie. And after we learn everything about Sid, maybe it's not so shocking, but the Sex Pistols are really struggling today. Like, there's a lot of discourse online. Like, people are not happy with multiple members of the Sex Pistols, and people are entering, and I think this matches where we're at today, just in the cultural zeitgeist of everything. People are not wanting to glorify Sid for anything. People are not that happy with some behavior that I don't know a ton about in regards to Johnny Rotten. So we have Sid Vicious, who is John Simon, and then we have Johnny Rotten. And thus, because Johnny Rotten, who is Johnny Lydon, had a hamster named Vicious, and I'm guessing maybe it's a play on something else where Sid came from. That is how Sid Vicious got his name. He was not vicious because he typically had the erratic behavior that we know him for. That was more of a sign of heavy drug use and I think being in the band, to be honest.
Yeah, I think the name was more of a joke. One of the resources for our research, Sid was referenced as shy, a bit goofy, and one person even calls him a bit of a burp. Like, he really was not anything to be worried about. And I think by naming him after the hamster and adding vicious to it was the joke of it, right? They're saying he's just as vicious as this sweet little hamster. And I don't know if he took that as a challenge, though, because he did eventually become actually vicious. He beat somebody with a bike chain. He would get into fights. He would break bottles on stage and gash his skin where he would be covered in blood. He really became this awful human being. And that's not even to touch upon what eventually happened between him and Nancy. It seems like he took this persona and really doubled down on it.
Part of me wonders if, too, since he was kind of a greaseball, if they were like, you're as dusty as my hamster, too. Like, you're just kind of grimy and weird, like my hamster, but maybe sweet like the hamster, too, is a good point. There's a potential, but like, our hamsters sweet? They kind of look cute, but then they kind of bite. And that's kind of like, all of this makes sense why they're choosing a hamster, right?
Yeah, that is such a perfect explanation for this person. And he really was young. And I think that shyness, that childlike behavior is part of it because he just was, he wasn't an adult. He was in his teenage years when he really started to become involved in this community, in this movement. He wasn't initially a member of the Sex Pistols. He was a part of their fan base, and he made a name for himself as someone that was a constant presence in the crowd. He's eventually credited with starting the dance, the pogo, where basically he just jumps up and down. And then he'd also get into fights every time there was a performance. And so he caught their attention.
It is so reminiscent, and there was like a couple of things that were like reminiscent of Anti-Flag, which is one of the bands that I still kind of love today, where Chris too was part of the fan base and then joined the band. He just didn't end up murdering somebody potentially.
And he probably could play the instrument that they had him join the band playing, right? There's a lot of discourse about how Sid couldn't even play the bass.
I think, of course, just how his life played out is a reason why everybody knows him, but I kind of think that was still evident when he was in the band as well, that he was a face that was continuing to catapult interest into the band, to continue to keep it relevant, to keep it young, to keep it hip, and which is just so ironic because he really was kind of nerdy, goofy, early punk. Very early punk. Very kind of like if you mix like a greaser with what we know punk as, or at least in like the early 2000s, not pop punk, but like true punk, like think like the Casualties, Anti-Flag, so many others that I'm probably not even thinking of, might not even know, that are underground or were too underground for me. It didn't exactly look like that, but again, it was like greaser mixed with that, you know, lots of leather, slick back hair. They would hang out at a sex clothing shop. That's how they worded it. Sex clothing shop, where something magical, quote, would happen if you hung around long enough.
And
which
what
is
does
so
that mean?
interesting to
Like,
me.
what is a sex clothing shop? Like lingerie? It wasn't very clear. Like, did they sell sex toys, lingerie?
Probably both. I think it was just a picture of the counterculture that they were trying to be at the time, and that they were at the time. Again, this is so early punk. So I think they were just finding out what that was.
He really became the poster boy of it. And I think that was part of the allure of having him join the Sex Pistols. Obviously, they needed a new bassist, but like I mentioned a little bit ago, Sid wasn't a great musician, but he brought attention to the band, more attention than they were getting, because what he was doing was so outrageous. And every time he was on stage, people would crowd to that side of the stage to just watch him mutilate himself, to abuse himself, to do whatever performance art he was doing. Because it really, I feel like that's what it was. It was very performative, which is ironic because like punk is supposed to be like anti-performative, right? It's supposed to be like authentic and real. And here Sid is trying to be punk and the face of punk, and it feels like he's putting on a show.
It's kind of wild when you break down that they met him in a photography class at Kingsway College. This is just a guy around their age that they met in college. I don't think they could have ever predicted the trajectory, not only of the band, but of Sid himself.
Something about Sid that I learned was the bleak childhood he had.
It was an unconventional childhood for sure. His mom, Anne, was a bit of a beatnik, early hippie of what the UK refers to as like the hippie movement in the UK. She raised him for part-time in Spain, and then they came back to the UK. She would roll joints for sailors to make money or extra money. When they were looking for a place to live, Anne came across a flat that she could live in where if you were heroin dependent, you could live there for free. And she goes, okay, yeah, I'm heroin dependent.
And they lived in that flat.
In that development, yes. Where this was unsafe was they, of course, were surrounded by people who were actually heroin dependent. By the time Sid was 16, she was heroin dependent. I believed he had already tried, maybe around 15, and she kicked him out. She said, it's either you or me, and it's not going to be you. I've got to try to preserve myself, and you just fuck off. So she was Well, she did things like roll joints for extra money while she was raising him and found a place the best she could for them to live. This was still her.
She was not what you would describe as a mother. I hate to say that, but it's true. She really did not look at herself as a maternal figure in his life. She looked at herself as his friend, one of his pals, and a lot of their friend group describes her as such. To give you an idea of the way she treated her relationship with her literal son, the night he overdosed fatally, he overdosed before, and he was able to come out of it. She sat in the room next door and didn't bother to help. When asked if he should be taken to the hospital, she said no. She was more worried about the press getting hold of this news.
I mean, one of the first things she did when he was released on bail was got him heroin.
Obviously, that was something that they did together, because growing up, that was what she did. And he eventually fell into addiction as well, because that's all he knew. But he had been 55 days sober. He had been withdrawing from drugs while he was in prison. And instead of telling her son, I can't get you drugs right now because we'll risk something bad happening, she still got it for him. And I think you're right. She took some sort of comfort in knowing that he was just as bad off as she was. And so, yeah, she's his mom by biology, but she wasn't his mom any other way. Because what kind of mom doesn't want better for their child? Doesn't make sense to me.
Especially when they're 21 going on 22 years old.
And have just been arrested for the gruesome murder of their girlfriend.
Yeah, she was stabbed many, many times. And while he claimed to not remember, which I tend to think that is actually all possible, does not erase murder. But I do believe it's possible that he was so drugged out of his mind that that's what happened. And Nancy, by the way, was also an addict. So it didn't assist in any single way for Sid, since that's what we're talking about today, in terms of any type of sobriety or addiction that he was dealing with.
Let's talk a little bit about Nancy. Now, obviously, her murder is one that's well known in the true crime community, and we've never covered it on the Murder Diaries because it's a solved case. But as we're talking about Sid, we can't ignore the fact that there was this life lost so tragically. And it all starts back when she travels to the UK as a fan of the Sex Pistols with the intention of betting a Sex Pistol. And one of Sid's bandmates later recalls in an interview taken decades after both Nancy and Sid's death that Nancy was intent on sleeping with one of the band members, and when he refused, she flipped right over and slept with Sid, taking his virginity. And from that point on, they were a twosome.
There had to be something there, toxic as it ever was, that kept them together. And part of that was probably their addictions and how intertwined the addictions became. Sid and Nancy, however it may have started, it was very intense and unlikely toxic, clearly. This quote keeps coming back to me, and I wanted to bring this up to you. On November 28th, after Nancy was murdered in October, Sid spent 4 days in jail, and then that was all in October. And then on November 28th, he was interviewed by an Irish journalist. And Sid said that Nancy's death was basically meant to happen and that Nancy always said she would die before she was 21, which she did. In that same interview, he's asked where he would like to be, and he said underground. He wanted to join Nancy. There was another moment of freak out saying that he wanted to join Nancy when he slit his wrist down or up to his elbow, saying that he wanted to join Nancy, and he got psychiatric care. So there was just a lot going on that was revolving around this relationship, around addiction, around extremely harmful, dangerous behavior. Not even just toxic,
No.
It was beyond that.
And a lot of people felt how dangerous it was and
Mm-hmm.
how it could eventually turn. We did learn that the Sex Pistols manager decided to take it upon himself and help Sid get off heroin, or he at least tried to. But in order to accomplish this goal of getting Sid off heroin, he had to break up, at least in his mind, he had to break up Sid and Nancy. So they beat her up, kidnapped her, and tried to put her on a plane. She actually jumped out of the trunk of the car, and there happened to be a police officer nearby who she ran up to for help, saying, "I've been kidnapped by the Sex Pistols." The manager, Malcolm McLaren, tells this story in an interview, and he sort of laughs when he says this whole thing, especially the part where Nancy says that she's been kidnapped by the Sex Pistols. I just think like they wanted so much for Sid to get better. They wanted so much for Sid to get away from Nancy, but the way they went about everything was so wrong.
And you can't even say, oh, it was immature because they were all in their early 20s. Like, that's not it. It was
No.
just wrong, beyond wrong. What else is interesting is that by December, Sid was dating somebody else, multiple somebody else's. This ends up getting him in trouble, this type of behavior, because he goes to a club in December of 78. Remember, Nancy has just been murdered, possibly by you, but you don't remember, 2 months earlier, not even 2 months earlier. And he goes to this club and he starts flirting with someone else. And then that gets him into trouble. There's a scuffle, and they end up, getting in like a physical fight to where stitches are needed. And Sid is arrested again. And this is how he lands in Rikers Island for 55 days, because they don't release him as quickly as they did in October for whatever multiple reasons there are. And I will say, Rikers Island is probably the most dangerous prison in New York.
Well, and
it's up there, but it's actually not even a full on prison. It's more of like a holding, but closer to like a jail, but it is known to be one of the most dangerous of that. Like, it's not a federal penitentiary yet. You are still waiting, but it is, again, it's very dangerous. He even suffered massive trauma. I mean,
he was
obviously
sexually abused and beaten while he was in holding
yeah,
there.
he may have also caused trauma to Nancy and anybody else, but in this case, he also suffered it at the hands of his mom and in this prison, Rikers Island. Oh. So this is where we get that 55 days being sober, and then the kind of wild night that ensues of his death in February of 1979.
So now it's February 1st, 1979. He's released from Rikers, and his mom has sort of gotten together his friends for a gathering at the apartment of this new girlfriend you mentioned. Her name's Michelle Robinson. And we know that his sole intention the minute he was released from Rikers was to get his hands on heroin. And like you mentioned, his mom did buy him heroin, and they realized it wasn't a good batch. And so he sent his friend out to go buy more heroin.
$200 worth, by the way.
Apparently with some good stuff, because the minute he's injected, he starts OD. And there's that scene where we described earlier, his mom's in the other room with the rest of the party goers, not really caring that her son is not breathing or falling into an overdose. And his friend Peter is the one trying to get him up and moving, because that's what they say is going to help him overcome this OD.
By the way, at this time, Sid is dating another girl. Her name's Michelle. This is different than the girlfriend he had when he was arrested back in December, in which he then spent the 55 days at Rikers Island. All that to say, this girlfriend is actually who finds him along with his mom on the morning of February 2nd, the following morning, because they were all doing drugs even as late as like 3 a.m. His mom also has supposedly claimed that Sid and Nancy had a suicide pact.
I was just going to say, while you were talking, I was pulling up the image of this note his mom Anne found in his pocket. It's 2 pieces of paper that look to be torn, and it reads, "We had a death pact. I have to keep my half of the bargain. Please bury me next to my baby. Bury me in my leather jacket, jeans, and motorcycle boots. Goodbye.
I wonder if it's been verified that it's his exact handwriting.
Nothing I've seen online says it's not his handwriting, but who's to say? We don't really know.
Yeah, you and I don't know.
She claims to have found it in his pocket that morning, but there's a lot of things that are up in the air about what actually happened the night he died.
I think that definitely plays into this idea of like a mercy killing type euthanasia thing too. That letter that we were just talking about also reminds me of another letter that Sid wrote to Nancy's mom when he was last hospitalized. He basically said the same thing. He said, we always knew that we would go to the same place when he died. We had so much wanted to die together, and she promised me the same. This is my final commitment to my love.
This is a man who has been publicly accused of killing this woman, and he's constantly trying to make her death about himself.
Deborah, Nancy's mom, was asked if they could spread Sid's ashes over her grave, and they were told no, but they didn't listen to her. And do you know who drove them to the site to spread the ashes over her grave? None other than Jerry Only from the Misfits, who I have seen perform. They've had more than one singer in the Misfits, and this is one of my favorites. And he drove them to scatter the ashes. And he was there the night that Sid died. I had no idea. This blew my mind. I'm staring at this guy perform, and I had no idea all this happened because it was just a little bit too before my time, and I was just a little bit more into the music than the whole culture of it all. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
and
no, exactly.
The internet was not a place where this was popping up to me at that time.
It sort of is reminiscent of Hugh Hefner making sure he's buried facing Marilyn Monroe's grave. Have you heard of that?
I have not.
These men just won't let these women rest in peace.
Yeah, let them rest, honestly. Especially since you very much may have murdered her. Now, we should say as well, we won't dive in too deep because it is a theory and that is all that it is. But somebody who lived down the hall from them actually had items that belonged to Sid. And they lived, like I mentioned, down the hall from Sid and Nancy. So we don't know, why did he have these belongings? He claims that Sid gave them to him for safekeeping, but he did later release those items to the police. But also, another fellow punk rock friend said that when they called this guy who went by Neon Leon, when they called him to tell them about what happened with Nancy, some other random guy picked up the phone and he said, I know who the murderer was, but refused to say who it was. So this guy is kind of on this periphery. He's nearby. He's got items. He's got somebody else saying, hey, I'm in this guy's apartment and I know who the murderer is. Hint, hint. But that's all it is. But it certainly is interesting. And it did happen. It did happen. There are books that talk about this. So all that to say, I don't know if Nancy can rest if this is questioned, and we don't really know who else could have done it besides Sid. Sid did not get a trial. We also have to somewhat respect that to a certain extent, but he was high out of his mind and doesn't remember her even being murdered, whether he did that or not. And in the meantime, Sid also died, and his estate was passed to some maternal cousins, according to a fellow bandmate in their autobiography.
It's incredible the mythology surrounding Sid and everything that happened in his life, his career, his relationship, his death, and the fact that he was only 21.
Right. It's really mind-blowing.
And, the more you strip away from all of it, the less cool it feels. I don't feel like it's very punk. I think it's more sad.
It is. It's a case of a young person who had a rough childhood and needed help. Not some cool punk rock counterculture kind of guy. It got glamorized.
Yeah.
I think the movie Sid and Nancy probably did a lot of that. I actually haven't seen that movie. I just know it's referenced a lot when you talk about the Sex Pistols or this story. Make sure to follow us on all of our socials at the Murder Diaries Pod. Follow us on YouTube. Tragic Hollywood is now being released on YouTube as well, so you can watch this episode there at the Murder Diaries Podcast.
And don't forget our schedule. Mondays, Tragic Hollywood. Tuesdays, Docufiles. And Thursdays, a true crime case that needs your attention. Thanks for being here.
Bye.